want to ask, is Marxism a theodicy? And I'm sorry for using such an archaic and obscure word, which very few people these days understand, but Marxism is a word we should use, I think. It shouldn't be put off, however blankly people may stare, and it's one I'll use quite a bit in what follows. As with many thinkers of genius, Marx was less original than some of his acolytes imagine. The idea of communism, of course, is of ancient provenance, as is the notion of revolution. The concept of history as a succession of modes of production is to be found in the Scottish Enlightenment. Marx himself, of course, famously denied that social class, or the idea of social class, was his own invention. And the same might be said for class struggle and exploitation, ideas which were by no means unknown to others, among whom is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The notion of alienation Marx took basically from Hegel, and in any case was anticipated in that idea by the great Irish feminist and socialist William Thomson, greatly neglected thinker. The idea that the state exists to protect private property had been touted as early as Cicero. The so-called economic theory of history has ranked among its supporters the egregiously un-Marxist Sigmund Freud, who held that without the coercion of labor, we would simply lie around the place all day in various interesting postures of jouissance. The late Raymond Williams was one of many to champion the idea of socialist revolution, the worker state, without being a Marxist, and so on. There is, of course, at least one strikingly original doctrine in Marx which lies at the very core of his thought. Anybody who wishes to know what this is can approach me privately later, and for a very modest fee, I will divulge it to you. Meanwhile, however, we can remind ourselves that though the doctrine of materialism is, of course, by no means original to Marx, his own interpretation of it is strikingly, breaks striking new ground, as he himself was well aware. Marx had no interest in the kind of philosophical materialism which asks what the world is made of. I mean, whether the world is made of matter, atoms, Geist, green cheese, or rat droppings doesn't seem to be a question, curiously enough, over which he lost much sleep. Materialism for Marx, I think, meant beginning from the fact that we're practical, material, corporeal beings. If you want to sell Marxism to postmodernists, by the way, just tell them that it's all about the body, and they'll come running. As Alfred Schmidt remarks in his great work on Marxism and nature, I quote, "The understanding of man," I suppose the old boy means ladies as well as gentlemen, "as a needy, sensuous, physiological being is the precondition of any theory of subjectivity." Thomas Aquinas, not often referred to at left conferences, the greatest theologian who ever lived and wrote, believed in his thoroughly materialist way that we thought the way we did because of the kinds of bodies we had, because of our species being, as Marx might have said. If our thought is discursive, shifting from one thing to another, for Aquinas it's because that's the way our senses and our practices are too. Aquinas didn't believe for a moment that our true identity consisted of some ghostly entity inside the body called the soul. For him, the disembodied soul of John Lennon, if such a thing exists, certainly isn't John Lennon. In a similar way, Ludwig Wittgenstein remarks that if you want an image of the soul, he says, look at the body, look at the human body. That's your image of the soul. The forms of life we share depend ultimately on the kind of bodies we have, which perhaps is why Wittgenstein enigmatically remarks famously that if a lion could speak, we would not be able to understand what he said. Aquinas might have said something similar about angels. It's what we do, Wittgenstein remarks in his book on certainty, it's what we do that lies at the bottom of our language games. An odd claim, in one sense, because, of course, what we do presupposes language games, presupposes concepts and meanings and all the rest. human practices dismantle the distinction between mind and body, matter and spirit, subjective and objective, all of those old dualities, because they're material realities which are alive with, instinct with, sense and value. Even so, there's a sense for Wittgenstein, as well as for Marx, in which the deed, though never, of course, a wordless deed, precedes the word when we look at things overall. The deed, paradoxically, is caught up in the word. Human actions are only actions because of meanings, because of purposes, intentions, and so on, yet somehow also, both Marx and Wittgenstein want to claim the deed has the edge, ultimately, over the word. And Wittgenstein's point, then, I think, is an authentically Marxist insight. To claim that human consciousness or subjectivity is corporeal is not to say that it's nothing but neurons, but rather that it's a revelation of the way in which the body itself is always unfinished, open-ended, prospective, self-transformative, always capable of more creative activity than what it may be manifesting right now. This kind of materialism, I think, means that we wouldn't need the concept of soul or spirit if we had a sufficiently rich and interesting and complex notion of the body. Could a machine think? Well, maybe, but surely in a way very different from ours because of its very different material makeup, in a way that makes the word think here analogous rather than exact. It's doubtful, surely, that there's a single process known as thought, which can then be transplanted indifferently to different kinds of material bodies. Our reasoning is the way it is because of the sensory, practical, biological, emotional contexts within which it moves. If a machine could speak, we might not be able to understand what it said. The word mind or consciousness is a way of describing that particular kind of expressive, significant, transformative, communicative lump of matter known as a person. More precisely, words like mind or consciousness are ways of describing how such persons can be together with each other at a level incomparably deeper, incomparably more intimate than mere physical contiguity or contact. Sexual relationships, for example, consist for the most part in talking, or am I missing out on something? It's not that we can communicate because we have a mind, it's that we have a mind because we communicate, and such communication is part of our species being, is built into the kind of corporeal things, if you like, natural material objects that we are. Language, as Marx observes, is the communal being speaking itself, the communal being speaking itself. The mind is not something inside us, like some sort of ghostly kidney, or spectral liver, and the world is not something outside us either. Wittgenstein quite rightly professed himself, with a certain faux naivete perhaps, to be puzzled by the philosopher's phrase, the external world. What on earth, he said, could that mean? To speak of the world as external. External to what? Also, for that kind of materialism, that interesting Marxian vein of materialism, not a sort of traditional, more ontological materialism, theory, thinking, reasoning must begin from the premise that men and women are in the first place practical agents. And it's astonishing, isn't it, how rarely in the whole rich legacy of Western philosophy that emphasis has actually been made. To begin to think about reasoning from the viewpoint of practical agency, which is one of the innovative moves, I think, that Marx himself made, and it's a view that runs clear contrary to many of the older strains of philosophical materialism. In fact, as far as this goes, Etienne Balibar is surely right to call Marx one of the greatest anti-philosophers of all time. Anti-philosopher meaning, I suppose, not just somebody who has no time for philosophy, which I suppose would include Dick Cheney and Mary Poppins, but those who are opposed to the whole philosophical project of their day for philosophically fascinating reasons, all the way from Kierkegaard to Derrida. Men, Marx writes in curiously Heideggerian vein in his comments on Wagner, do not in any way begin by finding themselves in a theoretical relationship to the things of the external world, the authentic note of the anti-philosopher, or one of them, you might say. Now, I'm not, of course, claiming that any of this exhausts the meaning of materialism in Marx's work, far from it. I'm just trying to light up the topic of Marxist materialism from what I hope is a relatively unfamiliar angle. In particular, what I've said doesn't address the question of historical materialism, which is what I actually want to talk about. In other words, all I've said so far is what I don't want to talk about. Yeah. I want to ask whether historical materialism is a theodicy, that's to say, a justification of evil on whatever ground, for example, that good might necessarily come from it, whether it imagines that certain historical evils are necessary, however rebarbative they may be, because, as I said, good might eventually flow from them. Because if Marxism does hold something like that, then no amount of chatter about the body is going to make people come running. Well, there's surely no doubt, to rehearse some tediously familiar positions, which I apologize, there's surely no doubt is there that in general Marx held that to go socialist you must be well-heeled, or at least if you're not well-heeled, some friendly and helpful neighbor needed to be. Socialism is possible, in other words, for Marx, only on the basis of a massive material surplus. Otherwise, class struggle, which is essentially a struggle over the surplus, over an insufficient surplus, will start up once again. And that doctrine surely is thoroughly an aspect of Marx's materialism. To go socialist, you need the proper material preconditions, not just a dogged will and a set of good ideas. And just as Marx sees human practices as dismantling the distinction between what we might call broadly the material and the moral, or spiritual, the same is true in a different way of his view of history. In one sense, material development in human history for Marx is also simultaneously moral development, as the advance of the productive forces promotes the unfolding of creative human powers and capacities. Marx is that proper kind of moralist, of course, a thoroughly traditional Aristotelian, Thomistic, Hegelian kind of moralist for whom morality is all about enjoyment and pleasure and self-realization and the unfolding of one's various powers, and only very secondarily in Kantian vein about things that you shouldn't or can't do. In Marx's view then, in one sense, from one angle, the moral and the material dance hand in hand. Capitalism makes us more subtle, sensitive, all-round, complex, diverse, and communicative people, whatever that guy selling socialist newspapers outside the supermarket might think. But of course, where the guy outside the supermarket is right, is that for Marx, simultaneously, the moral and the material are also at daggers drawn, as well as sides of the same coin. With class society, every advance of civilization is also an advance in barbarism. If it brings in its wake new possibilities of emancipation, it also arrives coated head to foot in blood. And capitalism, the particular mode of production of capitalism, will press this Janist-faced history to a surreal mind-warping extreme, which is why it demands that kind of philosophical doublethink known as dialectics. We pay for our freer, finer, more intricate existence, our keener sense of individual selfhood and agency, our enriched and enhanced powers and capacities in a currency of blood and wretchedness, which is why I think, though it's not fashionable or popular to say so, why I think Marxism is a tragic creed. Tragedy isn't, of course, the same thing as pessimism. It doesn't necessarily mean that things end badly. It means that to arrive at a felicitous outcome, If you do, and that in tragedy varies, you have to be hauled through hell. Yeah. And whether the kicks are worth the halfpence, as they say in English, as to say, whether the arrival is worth the journey, is a question which perhaps Marx might have pondered, and his acolytes certainly might ponder, rather more than he seems to have done. More of that in a moment. In one sense, history for historical materialism is not at all a tale of progress. This is where Marxists differ from the likes of old-fashioned 19th century liberal rationalists like Richard Dawkins, for whom we're all getting nicer and nicer all the time, give or take, the odd spot of genocide or imperial war, and only barbarous myths like religion prevent us from sailing triumphantly ahead into a kind of North Oxford utopia. I assure you I'm scarcely exaggerating. Now, you might say, by contrast with that sort of naive, self-parodic Enlightenment rationality, progressivism, by contrast, for Marx, we lurch from one form of exploitation to another. That's why Marx refuses to dignify everything that's happened so far, even with the title of history. It's merely prehistory. It's one wretched and, in a way, familiar form of exploitation after another. And the only truly historic thing to do, of course, would be to break with that and create the preconditions for history proper, about which, as we know, Marx has almost nothing to say. Yet the very process of lurching from one mode of exploitation to another, anti-progressive as it is, viewed from a more synoptic angle for Marx, I think, can be seen as a general movement onwards and upwards, as the forces of production unfold in general, whatever setbacks or stagnations they are afflicted with here and there, and men and women amass over the centuries through toil and blood and unhappiness, amass the material resources that might eventually form the basis of socialism and communism. Marx writes in Theories of Surplus Value that, I quote, "The development of the capacities of the human species takes place at the cost of the majority of individuals and even classes." How about that for the dialectic at a surreal extreme? The development of the capacities of the human species takes place at the cost of the majority of individuals and even classes in the whole, he means, of human history, meaning that the good of the species as a whole, as it will finally flourish and triumph in the shape of communism, that process, the process of attaining that worthy goal, involves misery and injustice for most members of the human race. Marx was absolutely cold-eyed and clear, I think, about that fact. The end and the means are notably, extravagantly askew to one another, as far as he's concerned. The material prosperity that will, in the end, fund human freedom is the fruit of non-freedom, is the fruit of unfreedom itself. History, as he famously remarks, progresses by its bad side. It is, as he observes in his writings on India, a hideous god, is a hideous god who drinks a nectar from the skulls of the slain. He doesn't, of course, deny that there is progress. He simply wants to rub our noses in the horrifying price that has to be paid for it. Is history for Marx, then, an exhilarating tale of progress, or is it one long nightmare? The only unequivocal answer is surely yes. And this, in the days when men wore sideburns and denim suits, is known as dialectical, was known as dialectical. The days when LA meant Louis Althusser rather than Los Angeles, and Rimbaud was a radical French poet rather than a cinematic strongman. When it comes to progress, Marx is neither a modishly skeptical postmodernist nor a dewy-eyed 19th century rationalist. So, socialism would seem inseparable from violence and exploitation, not, of course, in itself, but in the sense that the accumulation of the resources which will make it possible is itself only possible by virtue of class society. It looks as though injustice now is necessary for justice later. The same goes for oppression and freedom, or equality and inequality. Of course, it may be, somebody might argue, it may be that there's no real teleology here. There's no inevitable link between class society and communism, not in the sense that class society doesn't provide necessary material conditions, as well as some necessary spiritual conditions for socialism or communism, but they might say in the sense that communism or socialism is not itself an inevitable consequence of capitalism. History may simply culminate in barbarism, a plausible enough prospect for those of us who've been reading the newspapers. Even Marx, in one of his gloomier moments, speculated that the class struggle, he said, might end in what he called the common ruination of all classes. But he, of course, didn't have the pleasure of living on a planet rattling with nuclear weapons or rapidly running out of ecological steam, not to speak of a world able from time to time to buy off socialism through social democracy. So barbarism was less of a real global prospect for him than it is for us. In general, Marx does seem to believe, I think, that socialism is inevitable. He's mixed about the point, but he says so in the Communist Manifesto, he says so in Volume 1 of Capital, and he says so at various scattered points throughout his work. It's not, of course, he doesn't say this because he was an iron determinist, though he sometimes talks as though he is. It's because he thought that capitalism was bound to get a lot worse, and since there would then be no good reason why the working class shouldn't rise up and overturn it, they would do so. Paradoxically, the inevitability for Marx of a capitalist decline would itself furnish the basis for free political agency. For us, the inevitable is, of course, usually pretty unpleasant, and unless you resist it, you will never know how inevitable the inevitable was in the first place. For Marx, when thinking about socialism, this seems, at least at times in his work, not to be the case. He's talking then about what he thinks relatively free individuals are bound to do in specific historical circumstances. But this is surely a contradiction, since free means there's nothing that they're bound to do in specific historical circumstances. If there's only one course of action I can take, and if it's impossible for me not to take it, then I'm simply not free. We know that if you try to build socialism in backward, isolated, wretchedly impoverished conditions, the result is very likely to be Stalinism of some kind, but Stalinism isn't inevitable even then. The common people might rise up against the bureaucracy, or you might discover that you're sitting on the largest oil reserve in the world. It's hard to see, surely, how class struggle can be predetermined, or how Marx thought that it might be. He may have thought that socialism was inevitable, but he certainly didn't think that the Factory Acts or the Paris Commune were. Marx clearly believes in freedom and talks about it all the time in his political writings, about how people could have acted differently, for example. Even so, I think there's a strong case to be made that he thought socialism could only follow from capitalism. He claims at one point that Germany has to pass through a period of bourgeois rule before the working class could triumph. In other words, he's a kind of Menshevik avant la lettre. Though it's true that he later changed his mind on that particular point about Germany, but in a lecture of 1847, he defends free trade as hastening the advance of socialism. At one point, he considered, again in Menshevik spirit, that the unification of Germany would promote German capitalism, a development he cheers on at several places in his work as throwing the path open to socialism. It's well known that he thought Russia might be able to achieve a form of socialism based on the peasant commune. It's rather less commonly stressed that he didn't imagine this could be accomplished without the help of capitalist resources expropriated and parachuted in from elsewhere. So I think there's something in Marx to just justify the charge of theodicy. But there's also quite a lot to be said on the other side. For one thing, the fact that there's an internal link for him between capitalism and socialism doesn't entail that such links exist between the historical modes of production as a whole. By and large, he doesn't seem to have thought so. He registered his distaste for so-called universal laws of history more than once, insisting, for example, that his view on the transition from feudalism to capitalism in the West was not to be universalized. Nor does he seem to have imagined that feudalism or capitalism had to emerge. There are, within limits, various possible routes out of any given mode of production. Stages can be leaped and compressed and so on. Different modes of production can be synchronous rather than sequential, and certainly no stage in the historical progress exists for the sake of the others in a strong teleological sense. In this sense, at least, one might claim, whatever else it is, historical materialism is not a teleology. To say that capitalism, moreover, to say that capitalism can and must be drawn upon for socialism isn't to suggest in teleological or historicist spirit that it exists for that reason, or that its existence is anything but contingent. Besides, there's a difference, isn't there, between doing evil in the hope that good may come out of it, which is straight Theodicy, and seeking to turn somebody else's evil to constructive uses. Socialists didn't perpetrate capitalism and are innocent of its crimes, but given that it exists, it's rational and perhaps inevitable to make the best of it. Even then, however, it doesn't follow that the crimes of capitalism are retrospectively justified by the advent of socialism. In any case, capitalism isn't simply a matter of criminality, as Marx was well aware. He has, of course, great praise for capitalism and the bourgeoisie as the most revolutionary force history has ever witnessed. Capitalism isn't simply criminal, either instrumentally in what it might lead to, or inherently in terms of some of its more precious goods. And most of us don't accept anyway that socialism will follow inevitably on its heels, other than those of us who have been sitting for some time in darkened rooms with paper bags over our heads. And even those who do embrace the inevitability of socialism are scarcely likely to hold that the whole of history has been secretly laboring away to this end. So there are a lot of reservations to make about that model. Even so, we can still ask, surely, given Marx's theory, whether human history has been or would have been worthwhile. It's surely possible to claim, isn't it, that even if class society does in the end happen to lead to socialism, the price countless generations of men and women have been forced to pay for this felicitous outcome, on Marx's model at least, has simply been too high. How long would socialism have to endure, and how vigorously would it have to flourish to justify the unhappiness which went into its making? Could it ever? How could we possibly make recompense, retrospectively, to those humiliated and dispossessed billions? Max Horkheimer comments that, I quote, "History's root lies across the sorrow and misery of individuals. There is a series of explanatory connections between these two facts, but no justificatory meaning." Might not someone rather like Ivan Karamazov, handing in his ticket to heaven in protest at the sufferings of a single small child, simply choose to return their entry ticket to the New Jerusalem? Tragedy is not necessarily without hope. It's rather that when it does affirm, it does so in fear and trembling, aware of the fragility of all such gestures. In a movingly eloquent passage, Aziz Ahmad, writing of Marx on the destruction of the English peasantry, speaks of this horror as representing for Marx, I quote, "a sense of colossal destruction and irretrievable loss, a moral dilemma wherein neither the old nor the new can be wholly affirmed, and the glimmer of a hope in the end that something good might yet come of this merciless history." One might almost be describing King Lear or Oedipus at Colonus or something. Marx himself presumably believed that it would have been far preferable if human emancipation could be achieved with rather less blood, sweat, and tears. But he couldn't see how you could hold this and still be a materialist. His followers, of course, don't have to agree with him that capitalism is essential to socialism. If they don't, however, they might have to argue that one could and would have to develop the forces of production from a very low level in ways that remain compatible with socialist and democratic values. And that, of course, would be a fearsomely difficult project to carry through. Even so, we can surely speculate on what might have happened had capitalism never emerged. Could not humanity have hit upon some less atrocious way of evolving what Marx regards as its major and supremely precious goods: material prosperity, a consequent liberation from labor, collective self-determination, the flourishing of richly self-fulfilling individuals and relationships, and so on. Could that have been achieved otherwise? The question may prove more than academic. Suppose a handful of us were to crawl out on the other side of a nuclear or ecological catastrophe and set about the dispiriting task of building civilization again from scratch. Given what we would know about the causes of the catastrophe, would we not be well advised to try it this time the socialist way? But how might that be possible? Thank you.